Open your Bibles with me to Judges chapter 8. We continue through the book of Judges. Judges chapter 8. I'm going to back up into chapter 7, just get a running start on it, just to grab the context again. And so if we look back up to verse 20, we would see that Gideon's 300 warriors, 300 men of his army, had a torch in one hand and had a trumpet in the other hand and did not have a sword. How hard would that have been to go to the battlefield? 300 against 135,000. And they went to the battlefield, each man in his place. It says, verse 21, every man stood in his place all around the camp as they broke these clay pots, their torches, their light shone brightly, and they blew their trumpets and shouted that the Lord said, the Lord set every man's sword against him as they shouted the sword of the Lord, the sword of Gideon. And the Lord won this battle. The Lord fought this battle and turned every man's sword against himself, and 135,000 men began to slaughter each other as the 300 stood in their place with a torch and a trumpet. What a picture. The men of Israel then, in verse 23, 7:23, gathered together from Naphtali and Asher, Manasseh, and they pursued the Midianites. Then Gideon sent messengers throughout all the mountains to Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and seize from them the watering places as far as Beth Barah and the Jordan. Then all the men of Ephraim gathered together and seized the watering places as far as Beth Barah and Jordan. Verse 25, and they captured two princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb, and they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb. They killed the winepress of Zeb, and they pursued Midian and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of the Jordan. Brings us to chapter 8. Now the men of Ephraim said to him, why have you done this to us by not calling us? And when we were, when you went to fight with the Midianites, and they reprimanded him sharply, the Ephraimites said, why have you done this? You know, what is this they have done? But they simply did what God had called them to do and did it in obedience. And Gideon is put on display in the hall of faith in Hebrews 11 as a man of great faith. And we sort of saw the reality of that he didn't just come to that easily, that he was a man of great fear, and maybe even was a coward at the beginning. But the Lord worked in his heart. The Lord was patient with him, brought him along, and the Lord used this man in a great way. The Ephraimites apparently saw themselves as leaders and felt that Gideon should have checked with them before they pursued this, that maybe the Ephraimites had a different thought about how this should go. Ephraim apparently found out when Gideon called them and asked them to head off this escaping army, this fleeing army, head them off at the Jordan. Gideon answered in verse 2, so he said to them, what have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, and what was I able to do in comparison with you? When their anger toward him subsided, when he said that. And so Gideon humbles himself, quiets himself, and really results to flattery. Flattering them, saying, I haven't really done anything. And in fact, the gleaning is sort of the extra grapes, the grapes that are left on the vine after the harvest are greater than the best grapes of Abiezer. And it's just saying that your tribe and your area and your land is far above what Gideon's land was and what that tribe could do. And God has used them in a great way, points out, in taking Oreb and Zeb, and even sort of self-deprecating and saying, what have I accomplished? I've not accomplished anything, yet you've done this great thing. And so you look at this and you go, is this wisdom? Is this wisdom a man that is taking a gentle tone so as to avoid anger? This would you could find in a Proverbs, a soft answer turns away wrath. He could have got in their face. But maybe there's a in between there. Maybe there's wisdom in between that, because flattery is what you say to someone's face that you wouldn't say when they're gone. You know, a gossip is what you say apart from somebody that you would never say to their face. Flattery is the opposite. Flattery is you say it to their face, but you would never say it outside of that. And it's a manipulation using flattery, right? It's a manipulation, and the Proverbs speak of flattery being just as bad. A lying tongue hates those it hurts, and a flattering mouth works ruin. Flattery works ruin. That's in Proverb 26:28. Whoever flatters his neighbor is spreading a net for his feet. That the flattery was doing something negative there. And I think when I think about the attitude that Ephraim took towards Gideon, that this flattery was really just empowering them further to interfere in the things that God was doing. Wouldn't there have been wisdom in Gideon if he said, hey, we are doing what God has called us to do. And God has done a great work. And he could have gave a great testimony of what God has accomplished. But what you're going to find in this chapter is that you don't see God much. And if you remember back as they approached this battle, God was saying, Gideon, do this. Gideon, go here. And Gideon, do this. And Gideon was fearful. He said, Gideon, go down to the camp and listen to the Midianite camp. And he heard the dream. And God took care of his fears, and he brought him along and to this place where he said, now you may go down and do what I've instructed you to do. And Gideon finally arrived at that place. But the Lord walked him through all of this constantly. You don't see anything about the Lord walking him through or talking to him anymore in this chapter. And it's almost as if the battle was what the Lord had called him to, this battle, and the Lord sent the army flee. And it's almost as if Gideon said, I got it from here, God. I got it from here. And he no longer had conversation with God or sought the will of God, but he took off in pursuit with all those other tribes in pursuit, puts the Ephraimites in pursuit of them also. You have to wonder, is this the Spirit of the Lord was on Gideon when Gideon was doing the will of God? The will of God, the Lord was speaking his will into his life and preparing him and guiding him through it. And it almost feels like when you enter into chapter 8, when the pursuit of this fleeing army, that he is outside of God's perfect will, that he's kind of left what God would have him do. It's kind of interesting. It's a good challenge for us. It's good to think about our approach to when we are doing what we think that God has called us to do. So are we truly in his will? And are we hearing from him of that will? Their anger toward them subsided, and that's a good thing. It was a peaceful, it ended well. It was a peaceful sort of confrontation, and their anger subsided, and Gideon moved on. Verse 4, when Gideon came to the Jordan, and he and the 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted but still in pursuit. Then he said to the men of Sukkoth, please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian. Again, as I look at this and I'm pondering, is this Gideon acted in the flesh? Is this Gideon doing what's good for Gideon's reputation? Has he lost sight of what God wants him to do? Is he no longer listening to the things of the Lord? And the fact that he says, I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna. I'm pursuing them. Not that the Lord has called me to pursue them or anything along those lines. So he goes to Sukkoth and he says, hey, we need bread. We're hungry. And I see all of these sort of pitfalls appearing. And things that don't quite look right. things that, this is people of Israelite people in Sukkoth. And they have chosen to withhold giving bread to this pursuing army. Verse 6, and the leaders of Sukkoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hands, that we should give bread to your army? It's kind of a, sounds like a figure of speech that their hands would be, but that was what they did in those days, that they would actually cut their hands off. And can you imagine having this collection of hands of those that you killed in this pursuit? But the picture is that if you had their hands, it would be very clear that you conquered them and they're no longer a threat to us. But the men of Sukkoth are saying, you know what? These guys have terrorized them enough that they were worried about supporting this army that was chasing them down. Now, get this in your mind. This is 300 tired and hungry men chasing 15,000. 15,000 men are running from 300. And the people of Sukkoth don't know anything about what has happened. They just see 300 chasing 15,000, and the 300 are hungry, and they're like, I don't think so. These people that have been terrorized and were living in fear. Remember all the way back to the beginning of this whole section when the Midianites were oppressing, and it was not just the Midianites, but there were others that had joined them. And the whole nation, it said, was characterized by living in caves in fear. That the Midianites would come and they would take their crops. After the crops were planted, they would come in and take their crops, and they would just ravage the land, and so people were hiding in caves. First time we see Gideon he is threshing in fear. He was threshing in the wine press. He didn't thresh in a wine press. He threshed on the threshing floor, and it was a big, wide open area where the breeze would blow the chaff away when you threshed. But that was too visible for the Midianites, and so the people were hiding in caves, and he is threshing wheat in the wine press. This is where the Lord finds him at first. Gideon responds in verse 7. He says, so Gideon said, for this cause, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, then I will tear your flesh with thorns of the wilderness and with briars. And then he went up from there to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Sukkoth had answered. Verse 9, so he also spoke to the men of Penuel, saying, when I come back in peace, I will tear down this tower. And so he was going to, when he comes back, which is kind of a weird sentence, right? When I come back in peace, I'm going to destroy your town. I'm going to take your strong tower, their sort of their hiding place, their strong tower. He was going to destroy this. He was going to come back to Sukkoth, and he was going to take the men and take briars and thorns and thrash them. What a picture. Is this not a man that forgot his past? A man that was characterized of being full of fear, of threshing wheat in a wine press, of saying that when the Lord questioned him and began to say he was going to do a mighty work, he said, we're oppressed. Where is God? What's going on that we're having to live under these conditions? And that all the nation was hiding in caves and in fear. And yet now he's angry when somebody else is living in that fear, when he was just as timid, just as scared, and would have answered the same way previously. He's not very understanding. You look at this and you go, what would be accomplished by him punishing his own people in his own towns? And where was the testimony of what God had done? He did say that for this cause, when the Lord has delivered these men into my hand. So he still at least has it in his mind that the Lord is going to deliver them into his hand. And he at least believes that he is doing what God has called him to do. Now Zebah and Zalmunna, verse 10, were at Karkor, and their armies with them, about 15,000, all who were left of all the army of the people of the east, for 120,000 men who drew the sword had fallen. Then Gideon went up the road, up by the road of those who dwell in tents on the east of Nobah and Jagaha, and he attacked the army while the camp felt secure. And when Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them, and he took the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army. Karkor in verse 10 is not, it looks like a place. It's probably not really a place. It was, the word actually means a level place. There was a basin there. It was probably 2-mile by 5-mile basin, very flat, very wide open, that they were at this basin with their armies. And there was 15,000 of them in there. You can imagine across this flat plain that they could have seen an army chasing them down. Gideon takes a different road. He goes to this road of those who dwell in a tent, which is basically the road of the nomads. He took the road of the nomads, and you can map this out, that you can see he took this road, and he basically took a bypass, and he flanked them, and he came in by the side or by the rear of where they were running to. They had found some place where they were either felt secure in where they were, looking in the distance. They could not see any army coming. They felt like they were safe. 300 attacked 15,000. We don't get the details. Pardon me. We don't get the details of how this went, but 300 were able to conquer this entire army, and they took these two kings in captivity. Verse 13. When Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from battle, from the ascent of Harers, and he caught a young man of the men of Succoth, and he interrogated him, and he wrote down for him the leaders of Succoth and its elders, and 77 men. And so it is interesting to note that Gideon is identified as the son of his father. His father was a Baal worshiper, an idol worshiper. And it's interesting that gets thrown in here from time to time. Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from this battle, from the ascent of Harez. They don't really know what this is. Again, it's probably not necessarily a specific place, but more of a region, or talking about the geography. And he caught this young man and basically took him captive and forced him to tell who these leaders of Sukkoth were. The leaders, the elders of a town like that at the time would have been the two oldest men in the household for the town. And so the elder group, if there was 77, you're probably talking a town of 200 to 250 people was the size of this place. And he writes down these 77 elders, which there's a whole thing about writing that down, the ability to write that down and to write and to have something to write and all this, the whole sort of whole bunch of talk in the commentaries about how that would work and what they might have been writing. Verse 15, when he came to the men of Sukkoth, and he said, here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you ridiculed me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that you should give bread to your weary men? And he took the elders of the city and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Sukkoth. Then he tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of that city. Penuel was just like 5 miles down the road. He goes back to Sukkoth and beats these elders. He goes to Penuel and kills the men of that city. I struggled with this. I'm like, this doesn't sound like this is part of God's plan, to go in there and kill his own people. Now you can say, well, they must have been in cahoots with the Midianites. They had made a treaty with the Midianites, and they had, but there's no indication of that. They were simply like living in fear, like all of the nation was characterized as living in fear. And again, I see Gideon, a man who has risen to this power by the hand of the Lord, that the Lord led him there. The Lord won this victory. And yet, it's as if it's gone to his head, and he said, no, I got it from here, Lord. And And this doesn't seem like this was a work of the Lord. One of the commentaries made note that this man who once threshed wheat was now threshing his own people. The man that once tore down the Baal altar of his fathers is now tearing down the town tower, this strong place within the town. It's an interesting picture. What you see as you begin to look is this a man that did God's work and did God's will, but he's now not finishing well, that he's now outside of God's will, that he's now doing things differently. Let's go on. Verse 18, and he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, what kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor? And so we don't have any details of who was killed at Tabor. This must have been part of the terrorist acts of the Midianites as they were oppressing the Israelites, that they apparently attacked the people at Tabor and apparently killed some of which must have been related to Gideon. And so they answered, as you are, so were they, each one resembling the son of a king. I find that interesting. As you are, so were they. As Gideon stood there in front of them, he had just come from beating his own people and murdering the people of that town. I find that interesting. It's like, as they are, so were they. Each one resembled the son of a king. He was basically saying that these people of Tabor were strong warriors, and even though that they killed them, they died with honor. And it's sort of the picture that they would present to Gideon. Then he said, they were my brothers, the son of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had let them live, I would not kill you. Verse 20, and he said to Jether, his firstborn, rise, kill them. But the youth would not draw his sword, for he was afraid because he was still a youth. It's interesting now he's dealt with these two towns that were responding in fear, and he dealt very harshly with them, and now his son responds in fear when he says to draw your sword, son, and kill them. So the word used for youth leads you to believe he's somewhere in the age of about 10 to 12 years old. And he's with dad on this adventure. He's old enough to have a sword. It said he drew his sword, that he had his sword, but he would not draw a sword. So he was old enough that he had a sword, but you can imagine a young man that age didn't have the skill or the strength to use it well. Part of this idea for Gideon is for these great kings and all of their great reputation to be killed by the son of Gideon. Not by Gideon, the great warrior, the guy that has conquered this great army and done the work of the Lord, but Gideon goes and he killed Zebah and Zalmunna. And he took the crescent ornaments that were on their camels' necks. These crescent ornaments were a big deal. That was noted right with killing them, with executing these kings, that they immediately took these crescent ornaments, and they must have marked their camels for as royalty. Must have marked them as royalty as they rode, and it probably marked their tribe and who they were. There's some thought that there may be a religious tie to that too. These were crescent moon ornaments. They find these and they see these very things in excavations and archaeology, and you can read about some of those. Verse 22, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, both you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. And so again, the people that were characterized by fear are now responding, saying to rule over us. Gideon, maybe not even understanding that Gideon was previously without the hand of the Lord, Spirit of the Lord upon him, that he was simply a man just as scared as they were. But it was God's hand that used him in this way. And because he had delivered them, they offered him this to be their king. And not just for him to be a king, but to establish his dynasty so that his son would also be king after him and his grandson after him. And so they're offering this dynasty of kings for his family. And again, I look at this and I go, this is another opportunity for Gideon, another pitfall, another place where he can go wrong, and how flattering it would have been for him to be offered this kingship, that he had just done a great thing by the hand of the Lord. And for people to pat him on the back, it would be difficult for him not to receive that praise. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Well, this is the right words, right? And you go, okay, Gideon, this is the second mention of the Lord, but it's sort of a passing mention. You don't see Gideon giving a testimony of what God has done. You don't see humility. And if there is, it seems a false humility. As we go on, I think you see. He says the Lord will rule over you. Then he says, verse 24, then Gideon said to them, I would like to make a request of you, that each of you would give me the earrings from your plunder, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And so this request of, I won't be your king, but for you to take your plunder, your earrings that you had to plunder and give to him was an act of submission to him, of elevating him, of putting him in this place of power. And so while he says with on one side of his mouth, no, I won't be your king, the Lord is your king, with the other side of his mouth, he's saying, give me some of your plunder and honor me with your plunder. And so they did. The whole idea of Ishmaelites is not about earrings, but about the gold. That explains why the earrings were gold, is because they were Ishmaelites. The earrings were common across everywhere. And so the earrings were not specific to anything in this situation. They give him this. They give this earrings to him, verse 25. So they answered, we will gladly give them. And they spread out a garment. Each man threw into it earrings from his plunder. Now the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments from the camels, pendants, and purple robes which were on the kings of Midian, and because the chains that were around their camels' necks. Then Gideon made it into an ephod, and he set it up in his city. Ophrah and all Israel played the harlot with it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his house. This is about 45 pounds of gold that they collected up. You think about 120,000 soldiers that had just died, and they collected plunder from them. These guys all had gold earrings. That was a fair amount of gold. They give an earring to all of these, give some of their plunder to him, and it totals 45 pounds of gold. That's pretty amazing. He takes this gold, and even though he said, I won't be your king, I'm not going to be your king, but then he starts assuming this role as sort of this place of a king, that they would submit to him. And then he makes this ephod, which an ephod was part of the priestly attire of the tabernacle. And so an ephod, as described in Leviticus, in Exodus, the ephod was part of the priest's garments, that it was a garment that went over his undergarments, and it was a sort of a sleeveless garment, and it had gold, and it had probably purple, and had all kinds of different, had these colors, and so it was very ornate, and it had the stones of all the tribes on that. It had the top of it had stones, the names of the 12 tribes on there. So when the priest went into the presence of God, he was quite literally bearing the representation. He was bearing his brothers and sisters in the presence. So the priest was representing all of his people before God. And so this is that picture of what that ephod, and then at the bottom of the ephod was like a little pocket, and this little pocket had the human and the thummim in it, a couple of words that nobody really knows what they mean, and they don't know how this worked, but this is how they determined the will of God. The priest would go in, and they think maybe this was like a white stone and a black stone, and they'd say, God, do you want us to do this? And they'd pull a stone out, and like the white stone meant yes, and the black stone meant no. And this was a way that that God presented this to the priest, and this is how they would speak to God in some fashion. And so, again, we don't know the details, we don't know exactly that's how that was used. But it was a priestly garment, and only the high priest, only the priest wore this thing. Only the priest would do this. And so for Gideon to do this now is to say, I'm gonna take care of telling you what God has said. Remember, this is a man who put the fleece out and had to test God several times. This is like a permanent fleece. This is like, I'm just going to be able to go to God all the time and find out his will. And so he is setting himself up as the representative for all the people, and taking this gold, making this golden ephod, and he set the ephod up in his city. He set the ephod up, which is crazy, that he had this place that he set it up as if this was the end-all, be-all of worship. And all of Israel played the harlot, is this picture of them turning away from God and chasing whatever else. And over and over again, we see this cycle, right, through the Judges. But now it's happening, with internally, that they're taking something that was originally designed for the priest, that they're setting it up and even making it an idol and worshiping it completely apart from God. And so it was like we see over and over again, they either got the right God and they're worshiping him in the wrong way, or they got the wrong God and they're trying to worship, and they never could get it right, where they set aside all of these other things, all these idols, and did exactly what God had called them to do. Just to seek him, to be his children, to allow him to be their God. And that's all he wanted, was that relationship that he would foster and he would grow. And you see over and over again that they turn from that. And so he takes this ephod, sets it up. They quickly fall for that. They fell for everything. They fell for every possible God there was, it seems, except the right God, except their God. And it became a snare, it said, a trap. It became a trap to Gideon and to his house. And so all of those sort of pitfalls, I said, it looked like as he's chasing them, he's running into the Ephraimites. His men are starving, they're hungry. He runs into Sukkoth, he runs into Peniel, he's told no. And then he goes and he does win this big battle, and he claims it is by the power of the Lord. But then he comes back and punishes his people, and it doesn't feel right. It feels like he's beginning to be characterized by failure. A man that once was characterized by fear and cowardice is now tends to be characterized by failure, and it looks like he is failing. And clearly, as he sets this up, it is a failure. And so through this, we see the sort of the next round of apostasy, right? We see the next cycle of apostasy. With every cycle through the Judges, it just sort of descends to a new low. And the overall trend is one that's going down, that everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. And so the next slide to apostasy began right in the hometown, right where their deliverance started, was right there in Ophrah, when the Lord came under the terebinth tree and began to talk to Gideon as a mighty warrior. And there was nothing mighty about him. He was threshing wheat in a winepress. There was nothing mighty around him, but God did a mighty thing with him. And he lost sight of that. He forgot that. And he returns to his hometown instead of at the tail end of this praising God and giving testimony about what God had done in his people and through his people. He instead sets up an idol. Verse 28, thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel so that they lifted their heads no more. And the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Verse 29, then Jerubbaal, which is Gideon's name given to him by his father, if you remember back. And the name means Baal will deal with you. This was the name his father gave him when he tore down his father's altar to Baal. And the men of the town wanted to kill him. They wanted to execute him for doing that. And his father said, no, let Baal take care of himself. And so he names his son, Baal will deal with you. And you look at his life, and it looks like Baal is dealing with him. It looks like he is, that's what it looks like, but it's just Gideon's own sin in his life beginning to come apart. Jerubbaal was the son of Joash. Again, it's noted that he was this son of the idolater. He went and he dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring. For he had many wives, I would say. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name is called Abimelech. I can't remember 5 grandkids. I can't remember their names all the time. I mean, I can remember their names. I just get their names wrong. How do you remember 70 sons? I'd never get that right. And never. They'd have to put name tags on. His concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son whose name was Abimelech. The name Abimelech means, my father is king. So it's just kind of fascinating when he said, no, I won't be your king. The Lord is your king. And then he set himself up as this ruler in the land, this authority, and even where his son was named, my father is king. Verse 32, now Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a good old age, and he was buried in the tomb of Joash, his father, in Ophrah, the Bezerites. And so to be buried in his family tomb was a good way to die. It was a good, honorable death. He had done what God had called him to do, and he is noted in the Hall of Faith that Hebrew was this man of faith. And yet we see his failures, which ought to speak to us that God can use people that mess up, people that struggle with not messing up, people that are wrong, people that make mistakes, but weak people that even God uses in a great way. Verse 33, so it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. Baal Berith means the Lord of covenant. How offensive that must be to the Lord God. And Yahweh was their covenant God. They were the covenant people. Yet they chased after this Baal and said this Baal was a Baal of covenant. And again, you see the cycle just reaches to a new depth, that they associate this Baal God with something that the Lord had done in their life and their heritage. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all the enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, Gideon, in accordance with the good that he had done for Israel. So Gideon had done some good for Israel, and he had done what God had called him to do. And he had also started in fear and ended in failure, but he had still done what God had called him to do. Again, we see this cycle that the people after Gideon, lived for many years, that during those years, this next round of apostasy begins. When Gideon is gone, it gives this impression that Gideon was some sort of controlling force still, that the Baals, that Gideon would not allow that, but once he is gone, then the Baals immediately find their way back into their culture, and they're worshiping these false gods, and they play the harlot with these Baals because they no longer remember the Lord. And so all of those that would have been of that age, that when Gideon conquered the Midianites, the people that had been living in caves had now, enough years had gone by that those people would probably, most of them passed away, maybe all of them had. And you got the next generation that comes up and begins to chase after the Baals once again. The Midianites had been a tool of God's hand, that he gave them over to the Midianites because they were worshiping Baal, because they were worshiping false gods. That the Lord had given them over into their hands of this God until they cried out to the Lord and he delivered them. Have no memory of the good things God has done. And so there's some things distinctly missing from Gideon's life at the end here. And I'll wrap this up. First one I'd say is humility. And I think this is humility arrived at by remembrance of where he started. A man that remembers that when he started, he was weak, he was a failure, that life was very difficult under the hands of the Midianites, and that it was nothing to do with him and everything to do with the power of the Lord, the Spirit of the Lord that came upon him, and the direction of the Lord constantly speaking into his life to get him through that difficult time. And so humility of that comes from the remembrance of who he was before the Lord, apart from this work of the Lord. And I think it was drastically missing a guy that collects this gold and sets up an ephod and sets himself up as this authority over them. I think along with that idea of humility missing, I think reverence is missing. God is only mentioned in passing a couple times in the chapter. I think there was several opportunities for him to talk to the Ephraimites and say, God didn't call you, Ephraimites. You need to ask God why he didn't call you. I don't know. He didn't call you, but he called us, and he called us in a specific way. And we are doing what God has called us to do. And so, he had this testimony of amazing thing that God had used 300 of them. He could have explained this. He could have taken this firm stand with those people and said, get in behind us and let's go, instead of this flattery and this folding up. And likewise, when he goes to these towns of people that were characterized by fear, very much like he was, that he could have came in with this testimony of a great God that was in the process of saving them. And I don't, if you don't want to give bread, that's fine. But understand, you're missing out on an opportunity to be part of what God is doing as he delivers this nation. There's just no reverence. He's not speaking about what God has done. He said he was chasing them. He was going to capture them. We saw that Gideon worshiped when the Lord had him go down to the Midianite camp right before the battle. He said, if you're afraid, Gideon, go down to the camp and listen. And they sneak down to the Midianite camp, and he hears the guy talking about his dream. And he hears this dream, through this dream, that this Gideon, God gave Gideon a reputation amongst this army and put fear in their hearts. And Gideon, it says, he worshiped the Lord because of that. That all of the tests and everything he'd done, he came to that moment, he finally realized God was doing something, and he worshiped him. And then you don't see any of that anymore. It seemed like he left that reverence. Like once the battle was over, the Lord had won the victory. That he'd pushed the Lord aside. I'll take it from here, God. The third thing I think Gideon failed at, it's missing from his life, is a legacy. That finishing well is important. and finishing well is done so as not to taint the memory of what God has done. Because as I studied this, I look at this and go, God did something amazing, but Gideon is putting himself and the things he was doing was sort of tainting what the great thing that God had done. And so Gideon's later years were marked with apostasy, with leading other people away from God, not to God. When he had a great testimony that should have lasted a lifetime. This is a man that had 70 sons, that every one of them could have been built up into their life of, let me tell you what God did for you. Let me tell you what God did through me. And I was nothing, but God has done an amazing work. And he speaks that into 70 sons who speak it into their sons, and it changes the world. And the same is true today. Gideon's later years were marked instead by apostasy. Brought on a desire for money, a desire to rule, having a son that said, my father is the king. And so failure becomes this, it's been said, failure is the invitation to have recourse with God. Failure is an opportunity to have recourse with God. And maybe as we sit here today, we read this story, and it is a difficult story to figure out. But we can see that God uses flawed people in big ways. That way, none of us can exclude ourselves from what God might want to do in your life, and how he might use you. You can't exclude yourself. You can't say, well, I'm nobody. I've messed up too bad. I've sinned too bad. I've fallen too bad. Now, God can use every one of us, should he choose, for great things. But the first thing and the greatest thing is the yielding of our life to him. This is the greatest miracle. And it's amazing how little is thought of that great miracle. That more people plot their vacations and spend time talking about their vacations, plotting their retirement, of what we're going to do here and what we're going to do there and how we're going to do this and where we're going to visit. We spend all this time in our life, and we spend very little time thinking about our eternity. And we could bebop through this whole life and never look at our eternal life and spend very little time looking at what is about to happen. Because there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee that before this service ends that our time would be up and we would stand before the Lord. It amazes me the sort of frivolous nature we have, that we would just look at something so important and just desire not to be distracted by it. That's not for me. I'm busy. I have this figured out. I'm a good person. Let's bow our heads.